Good day. In my last video, as I spoke about the ongoing collapse of the military situation, the Ukrainian defenses in Avdeyevka, I said that at some point over the next couple of days, we would have a meeting between the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, and the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, in which Shoigu would provide a report about the situation in Avdeyevka and confirm to Putin the fact of Russia's victory. Well, just a few hours later, the meeting between Shoigu and Putin duly took place, apparently in the Kremlin, and the Russian Defense Ministry and Sergei Shoigu have now acknowledged that there has in fact been a battle in Avdeyevka underway, and that the Russians have won, and that Avdeyevka is now fully under Russian control. Now, we've had accounts of this meeting from both the Kremlin and from the Defense Ministry. The Kremlin's account is very brief, and it reads as follows. Vladimir Putin heard a report from Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu on the capture of Avdeyevka. The head of state congratulated the Russian military on such a success and important victory. On February 17th, the Center Group of Troops of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, under the command of Colonel General Andrei Mordvichev, took full control of the city of Avdeyevka in the Donetsk People's Republic. That's the entirety of Shoigu's report, according to the Kremlin. The Russian Defense Ministry has actually provided a fuller account of the meeting, and a much more interesting one. And this is what the Russian Defense Ministry says about this meeting. Today, in the Kremlin, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, General of the Army, Sergei Shoigu, reported to the Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Armed Forces on the complete seizure of the town of Avdeyevka. The town, which represented a powerful defensive stronghold of the Ukrainian armed forces, has been taken under control by the Center Group of Forces under the command of Colonel General Andrei Mordvichev. As a result, an area of 31.75 square kilometers was liberated from the Ukrainian nationalists. That's the Russian perspective on the war. Over the past 24 hours, the enemy losses near Avdeyevka have amounted to more than 1,500 servicemen. Now, that is the first figure the Russian authorities, the Defense Ministry, has given for Ukrainian losses in the Battle of Avdeyevka. But note, it only covers Ukrainian losses over the previous day. It does not give us a full account of the losses, Ukraine's losses, over the last few weeks or since the operation to capture Avdeyevka began in October. And we're not given a breakdown of what these 1,500 Ukrainian troops who the Defense Ministry says Ukraine lost. We're not given a breakdown between killed, wounded, or captured. So we've still got a lot of information, which no doubt will be provided in due course. Anyway, the report continues from the Defense Ministry. Under the continuous fire, damage, the Russian forces hit Ukrainian units trying to leave Avdeyevka in a hurry, leaving weapons and hardware behind. At present, measures have been taken to fully clear the city, which is an admission that there are still Ukrainian troops in Avdeyevka, and block Ukrainian units that have left the city and settled at the Avdeyevka chemical plant. I believe this is the same as the coke factory, which we've been hearing so much about. I said in my program yesterday that it appeared that some Ukrainian troops from the Azov brigade the 33rd Assault Brigade, as it now calls itself, have gone underground, as they did in Mariupol, and are hiding in basements and bunkers and tunnels behind the coke factory. There was a picture, a film that appeared yesterday of Russian troops raising the Russian flag over a building in the coke factory, but it's clear that there are still Ukrainian troops in the coke factory, presumably hiding in these tunnels. And as Shoigu says, it's clearly a mistake. There were lines of retreat from the coke factory. By going underground, they have essentially trapped themselves, and the Russians are taking steps to ensure that the trap closes. And then Shoigu goes on to report the liberation of Avdeyevka has made it possible to move the front line away from Donetsk to secure it from terrorist strikes by the Kiev regime. In other words, the Ukrainians used to shell Donetsk city from Avdeyevka. They no longer can. And then a very interesting paragraph, details on the advance of Russian troops has not been published till the complete defeat of the enemy and the full liberation of the city. I've been making this point now for, well, several weeks, 2 weeks I think, that the Russian Defense Ministry has been withholding information about the Battle of Avdeyevka. I think they've been doing this since October, actually. And, well, the Russian Defense Ministry now confirms that they've, up to now, had a deliberate policy of silence with respect to the fighting in Avdeyevka. So all of these figures of Ukrainian losses that the Russian Defense Ministry has been publishing over the last few weeks and months do not include Russian estimates of Ukrainian losses for the place where the most intense fighting has been taking place, which is Avdeyevka. And we know that over the last couple of days, the Russian Defense Ministry has been claiming that Ukrainian losses each day have amounted to more than 1,000 men across the battlefronts, 1,000 men killed or wounded. But to repeat again, that has not included figures for losses in Avdeyevka, and we see that Shoigu is saying that the Ukrainians lost 1,500 men in Avdeyevka just over the course of the previous 24 hours. And then the last paragraph of this brief report from the Russian Defense Ministry says that the units of the Center Group of Forces continue the offensive to further liberate the Donetsk People's Republic from Ukrainian nationalists. Now that is, by the way, a very interesting paragraph, because as I well remember, after the battles of Mariupol, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, and Bakhmut, the Russians gave themselves a rest, which gave the Ukrainians an opportunity to stabilize the situation and to recover. Whereas on this occasion, the Russians are apparently strong enough. Their losses in the Avdeyevka battle have been low enough. Their army is now big enough that they feel that they can continue the offensive. Not just the offensive across all of the other front lines, but specifically the offensive in the area of Avdeyevka, which is essentially what this paragraph is telling us, because it says that it is the units of the Center Group of Forces, those commanded by General Mordvichev, which will continue a further advance. So no slackening or end of the offensive up to this point. So that's the information that the Kremlin and the Russian Defense Ministry have given us. Avdeyevka under Russian control. In fact, we've been getting lots of films now and pictures of Russian troops raising their flag in every part of Avdeyevka, including, by the way, the 9th quarter, the Chemik micro-district, the place of the high-rises, the citadel. So the Russians are in full control of all the territory of the metropolitan, the residential part of Avdeyevka. There are, however, by the Russian Defense Ministry's admission, still large numbers of Ukrainian troops in Avdeyevka. I say large numbers of Ukrainian troops. I don't actually know how large the numbers in fact are. They might just be a couple of hundred, but there are still troops, Ukrainian troops, to be rounded up. Some of them might put on a desperate resistance in this terrible situation. Others might still be trying to look for escape routes to Ukrainian lines. Also, I think, a desperate thing if that's what they decide to do. There are, however, reports that the Russians are now taking hundreds of prisoners. Some reports say that 500 prisoners were taken over the course of a single period of about 24 hours. We'll just have to wait and see. But anyway, large numbers of prisoners are apparently being taken. The town is being rounded up. No doubt engineering units of the Russian army will be moving into Avdeyevka to clear the place of booby traps and mines and those sort of things. And then the Russians, once they fully consolidate control of Avdeyevka, will have to decide what to do with the place. Do they rebuild it? Do they rebuild it in the same way that it was before the conflict, as a mining village or town? Or do they reconstruct the industrial facilities that were there? Or do they transform it entirely, as they seem to be working to do towards Mariupol, where the historic buildings like the drama theatre appear to have been largely rebuilt, but where the residential areas are being built entirely afresh? Well, that is a decision for the future. In the meantime, we have, as it happens, received further reports about Russian military activity around Avdeyevka. It's now confirmed that the Russians are indeed pushing westwards, that they've now entered the village of Lastochkino, or Lastochkino, I'm not quite sure precisely how the name of that village is pronounced, but they've entered it. The remnants of the Azov Brigade, the 3rd Assault Brigade, who are defending this village, are, as you would predict, anticipate from these highly motivated soldiers, putting up a stiff resistance, trying to act as a rear guard for the Ukrainian forces that are retreating from Avdeyevka. But it's only a matter of time, probably no more than a day or so, before this village is also secured. And then the way is open for the Russians to continue their advance. They'll be able, now that Avdeyevka is under their control, they'll be able to push towards these other villages that exist in this area, Stepnoye, other villages further north, Berdichi, for example. They'll probably want to push up the railway line towards Ocheretinye. They'll probably want to do all of these things. Now that Avdeyevka has been brought under control, it will be much easier for the Russians to do these things because, of course, they can concentrate far more troops and machines in order to do that. And, of course, their air force now dominates the skies over eastern Ukraine. I will just make here one little comment about one rather curious event. When the reports were circulating a couple of days ago, it seems like now an age ago, that Syrsky and Tarnavsky were rushing reinforcements to Avdeyevka in order to stabilize the situation there and retain control of the town. A picture appeared of an Abrams tank, and it looked as if Ukraine was deploying, finally, Abrams tanks to the battle in order to try to support this counteroffensive that the Ukrainians were trying to launch in order to stabilize the situation in Avdeyevka. And several people thought that the way these tanks, these American tanks, would be used would be in the much discussed and talked about advance towards the village of Krasnogorovka, north of Avdeyevka, which the Russians captured way back in March last year. That offensive, about which I was always deeply skeptical, needless to say, never materialized. Anyway, a film has now appeared, taken, as far as I can see, either by a civilian or Ukrainian soldier. In other words, it is not an official film. But anyway, a film has now appeared showing this same tank, I presume it is the same tank, dashing up a road, trying to escape the Russians, the advancing Russians. It looks as if that tank was deployed to the area all by itself. It was a stunt. The picture of it was a stunt. It was never meant for real. The Ukrainians have still not deployed their Abrams tanks to the battle zones, or most of their Challenger tanks, Challenger 2 tanks, or, by the way, most of their Leopard 1 tanks. There's been few scattered reports of Leopard 1s appearing on the Ukrainian battlefields, but the Ukrainians have been holding all of these tanks back, either under instructions from Western governments not to deploy them, given the way that they might be burnt up by the Russians, with all the humiliating effect that that might have, or alternatively, the Ukrainians might be holding them back because they feel they need these tanks to provide some kind of operational reserve in the rear. Or there's a third possibility, which people have not commented about, which is that the Ukrainians have lost faith in these Western tanks, that they have failed dismally on the battlefronts. The Abrams tank has proved impossible for the Ukrainians to maintain on the battlefield, as was, by the way, predicted by all sorts of people familiar with that tank, Daniel Davis, Brian Belletti, people like that. And one way or the other, it looks as if the Ukrainians are very, very uneasy and reluctant, for the moment at least, to use these tanks in actual battle. Anyway, it was a rather sad and pathetic picture, seeing this solitary tank trundling at speed down the road, not towards the Russians, but away from them. Now, there's one final observation to make, and this also comes from Russian reports, scattered Russian reports about the report that Shoigu gave to Putin, and it's also been further provided by the Russian Defense Ministry. The Russian Defense Ministry has provided more information about the course of the battle itself, about Avdeyevka, and they say that the primary that the order, again I'm reading from the Russian Defense Ministry, the order of Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Syrsky to abandon the city was issued only a day after the Ukrainian troops began their uncontrolled escape from Avdeyevka. That is from a further report of the Russian Defense Ministry. Now, again, this corresponds with the information I've been seeing from many quarters, and which I discussed in my previous 2 or 3 videos. I said that it looked like there was an uncontrolled collapse and that the Ukrainian soldiers were abandoning their positions and fleeing by themselves, and that General Syrsky's order was really more an attempt to take control of a process of retreat and abandonment that had already begun without official sanction from Kiev. And the Russian Defense Ministry is in effect confirming that that was indeed the case. The Russians presumably know when it was that the soldiers, the Ukrainian soldiers in Avdeyevka, began to lose cohesion and give up. So there we are. I would say that there have been lots of pictures now, drone footage and such, of Ukrainian soldiers in small groups trying to flee Avdeyevka. It's actually sad films to see. They're walking very cautiously along roads and fields. One wonders how many of them are really able to get through. I see no sign that they're retreating using armoured vehicles or vehicles of any description. They're all doing it on foot. They're not carrying heavy weapons, obviously. And it looks like a completely spontaneous and disorganized withdrawal. Certainly one isn't seeing entirely, entire formations carrying out an orderly withdrawal from Avdeyevka, and one wonders how many of them, as I said, are going to get through. There's lots of reports that the town is full of bodies of Ukrainian soldiers. I remember hearing exactly the same thing said about Bakhmut. Again, at some point, presumably, the Russian authorities, the Defense Ministry, will give us an up-to-date figure for Ukrainian casualties, and one hopes that the Russians will do as they have been doing throughout the war up till now, collecting these bodies, treating them properly, working to identify who these dead soldiers are, and making arrangements for the return of these bodies to their loved ones in Ukraine. Anyway, the effective end of the Battle of Avdeyevka, but not the end of the Russian offensive in this part of Donbass. As I said, Shoigu and indeed Putin have effectively made that clear. General Mordvichev, fully in command, as I said, he has shown virtuosic skill in using all the weapon systems available to him to capture what was, by wide acknowledgement, the most heavily fortified town on the entire Ukrainian defense line. Anyway, General Mordvichev now has apparently a lot more work to do in front of him. Now, the Institute for the Study of War have now come forward and have told us that the reason that the Russians have achieved this success in Avdeyevka is because of their complete air superiority. They have now, in effect, achieved air superiority over the eastern battlefields. And this is, I think, unequivocally true. And I can remember way back in 2022, reading a report in the Financial Times as the Russian missile offensive against the energy system, the Ukrainian energy system was underway, and the Ukrainians were depleting their arsenal of air defense missiles. I can remember reading warnings from military people that if Ukraine's air defense system became depleted to the point of total exhaustion and the Russians were able to gain air superiority over Ukraine, such as they now have, it would be devastating for Ukraine. And I also remember in the autumn of 2022, an extremely helpful, in fact, he has been invaluable, member of the Duran community, a source, coming forward and providing me with an explanation about the difficulties of using artillery fire to break fortified positions. The most effective way to do it would be by using heavy bombs. And in Avdeyevka, we've seen a dramatic confirmation of this fact, that it's this rain of bombs. By some estimates, the Russians dropped something like 500 heavy bombs on Avdeyevka just over the last week, which is a staggering number. It was this rain of bombs that General Medvedev was able to bring down, which smashed Ukrainian defenses and basically pulverized the Ukrainian army and made it much easier for the Russians to advance in the way that they did. And I ought to say that, again, another of my invaluable sources, one who has contacts with the Russian military, he's told me, and when I say Russian military, I mean actual frontline soldiers, people who actually fight on the front lines. He tells me that the soldiers are now finding the actual conduct of the military operation, special military operation, much easier, well, easier, maybe much is too strong word, but easier than it has been at any time in the past. Ukrainian artillery is now significantly lighter. They themselves are better equipped and are better armed. And importantly, they're able to bring down airstrikes on Ukrainian positions. The ability to communicate between frontline troops and the Russian Air Force, all the problems of overcomplicated communications that bedeviled the Russian system in the early weeks of the war. Anyway, they've all been resolved, and Russian aircraft are now able to operate at will. The Ukrainians, by the way, claimed on the last day of the Battle of Avdeyevka that they'd shot down 3 Sukhoi 24 fighter bombers over Avdeyevka. The Russians have flatly denied that claim. They said there is no truth to it. 1 Sukhoi 35 apparently was shot down, but the Russians say it happened as a result of a friendly fire incident. And it seems that Russian output of fighter jets is increasing all the time. And in fact, the preponderance of Russian fighter jets is growing. Russian aerial dominance is increasing. Now, in any discussion of Russian aerial dominance over Ukrainian front lines, we have to, of course, address the question of the F-16s. This story of the F-16s that we've been hearing so much about. There's reports that Ukraine, this is Kirill Budanov, he's now saying that the first F-16s will be delivered to Ukraine at some point in the next few weeks. I've heard that story several times before. What I will say about that is this. I think it was pointed out by a US Air Force officer, or perhaps even it was General Milley himself, that the relatively small number of F-16s that Ukraine is going to receive, even if they've been significantly modernized, is not going to counterbalance the very much bigger and far more powerful Russian Air Force operating with far more sophisticated fighters. It can't make up that balance. Also, one does wonder about the level of training of the Ukrainian pilots who are going to fly these F-16s. And lastly, given Russian abilities to launch relentless airstrikes on Ukrainian air bases, and given the difficulties in operating F-16s, they apparently need pristine runways in order to take off. One wonders how effective these F-16s are going to be. If they are based in Western Ukraine, or, as some people have been suggesting, in Poland and Romania, because of the problems with the bases, then I believe that they will be out of range to conduct operations on eastern Ukrainian battlefields. They might be able to reach those battlefields, but an effective radius of action, it's the eastern Ukrainian battlefields are still too far away. So, more likely than not, if my understanding of this is correct, which of course people are free to argue that it is not, this Russian air superiority is now here to stay. The Ukrainians are acknowledging that they're only able to shoot down at most half of the missiles the Russians launch at them. The Russians have vast stockpile of missiles, even by Ukrainian admissions. The Russian Air Force has got bigger. It looks to me increasingly as if this battle for the skies of Ukraine has now been conclusively won, and won by the Russians. In which case, Russian ability to bomb Ukrainian defense positions is going to put the Ukrainians in a very difficult situation. Well, it's not just Avdeyevka where the Russians are advancing, because even as General Mercouris has been, in effect, given the green light to continue his advances further, and I'm not going to try, by the way, to speculate what he proposes to do, whether he's going to advance towards Pokrovsk, or whether he's going to advance towards Ocheritenye, seize that village, and then push towards the northwest and try to outflank Ukrainian forces in northwestern Donbass. I do not have those skills. I will leave that to those who understand that kind of thing better than I do. But anyway, the point is that it's not just going to be General Mercouris who's going to continue conducting his offensive from Avdeyevka. The Russians continue to advance on every part of the front lines. And I said over the course of a number of recent programs that the fact that the Russians had stopped providing updates about the fighting in Zaporozhye, in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area, suggested that they might be preparing to launch an offensive there. And, well, afterwards they lumped together that theatre with the Kherson theatre, and they did resume reporting about Zaporozhye. But anyway, whatever, the fact is they have now launched an offensive there. And it appears to have gained quite a lot of ground and to be very powerful indeed. There are reports from Ukrainian sources that there are 60,000 Russian troops concentrated in this area, which, as several people, Dima at the Military Summary Channel, for example, are pointing out, is actually a larger force than the force the Russians have used to capture Avdeyevka. So there is now a Russian offensive underway in Zaporozhye region. It looks like one of the initial objectives, but surely only an initial objective, is the full seizure of Rabotino, another place, by the way, which President Zelensky of Ukraine supposedly visited just before the Russians move on to capture it. I'm going to guess that from now on, Ukrainian soldiers, whenever Zelensky appears on the front lines, are not going to be happy to see him there, because he appears to be a harbinger of bad news. But anyway, put that aside, it looks as if the Russians are launching some kind of big offensive towards Rabotino. And as Dima at the Military Summary Channel correctly says, it's scarcely plausible that the Russians are simply aiming just to recapture Rabotino. They're presumably planning something more ambitious. Maybe they intend to advance towards Orechov and finally take that town, also heavily bombed, the place from which Ukraine launched its summer offensive. Maybe the Russians plan to take Orechov back under control, or maybe they're planning something more ambitious still. Maybe they are going to advance towards the big city of Zaporozhye, a city which before the war had a population of around 1 million people, located on the east bank of the Dnieper River, further north. That would be a very, very challenging operation indeed, trying to capture Zaporozhye. But I would say that there seems to be little evidence of fortified positions held by Ukraine in this area. And as we know, General Tarnavsky and General Zaluzhny before, and then General Tarnavsky and General Syrskyi, the Ukrainian commanders, who have had overall responsibility for Zaporozhye, have withdrawn most of the Ukrainian forces from this area. They redeployed them to Avdeyevka, 47th Mechanized Brigade, 3rd Assault Brigade, all sorts of strong units like that. They've been smashed up in Avdeyevka. They still have to contend with the fact that General Mordvichev will be advancing westwards from Avdeyevka. And of course the Russians are now striking north from Zaporozhye as well. Now, it's always tempting to say that this Russian advance from Zaporozhye must have been coordinated, that the Russians must have been expecting to capture Avdeyevka around this time, and that is why they've now launched this offensive. I doubt this is plausible, actually, but who knows? Anyway, In any event, a big Russian advance offensive in the Zaporozhye region, until we have more information about what it is achieving and what its objective is, it's difficult to say more about it, other than the fact that it is actually happening. But further Russian advances in all sorts of other places as well. In the Marinka area, just south of Avdeyevka, and I understand that Marinka also falls under General Medvedchev's areas of responsibility. Anyway, there, the Russians continue their advance in Novomikhailivka. As I said, they now seem to control a substantial part of this village, and they're pushing hard to capture the rest of it. They seem to have launched their attack to storm Pobieda, village somewhere to the northwest of Novomikhailivka. And, well, we've been hearing less about their advance through Georgievka for some time, and their eventual push towards Kurakhovo. But I will say this: if the Russians advance west from Avdeyevka, then Kurakhovo, which is not that far from Avdeyevka, actually. This is a fairly, as I said, contained area of the battlefronts. Well, the Ukrainian troops in Kurakhovo could potentially soon find themselves in a kind of salient, an area where the Russians are on three sides of them. And whilst that would not be an encirclement, there would still be lines, supply lines to the west. It would be, I suspect, an increasingly difficult position in which to be. Anyway, that's the only thoughts I can have about this. And there's lots of very confusing reports coming from the Bakhmut area, some suggestions that the Russians are pushing into Chasiv Yar, complaints from Ukrainian soldiers that there are no fortified positions, no fortifications of any significance in Chasiv Yar itself, that this town is not really capable of being defended. By the way, I remember a year ago a Ukrainian soldier telling a Western journalist that very thing. I'm seeing some Ukrainian soldiers, as reported on Telegram channels, Slavyangrad and others, are reported as saying the same thing now, despite the fact that Chasiv Yar is on a height. But anyway, there is reports that the Russians have entered at least the part of Chasiv Yar that lies to the west of the Chasiv Yar Canal. By the way, I doubt that that is a significant obstacle for the Russian advance. And, well, we've had fewer reports about the fighting in the two villages to the west of Bakhmut, Bogdanovka and Ivanivska. But as I have said many times, that does not mean that the fighting in these villages is not intense and that the Russians aren't gaining ground in these places. But the most dramatic news, interestingly enough, comes from the Liman area, where we're told that the Russians have resumed their advance towards the Zherebets River, that they've now reached the outskirts of a village called Terny, which presumably, once they've consolidated this latest advance, apparently an advance of around 2 kilometers, they will move to Storm. And if they reach the Zherebets River, it seems the other villages strung out along the Zherebets River are largely undefendable. Supply lines are difficult. The Zherebets River is itself a relatively small river. That puts the Russians in a good position to cross the river, move on towards Liman, if that is their plan. And of course, that might be plausible given that the Russians further south appear to be wrapping up the battle for the village, the small town of Belogorovka in northern Lugansk region. They could be preparing soon an attack on Siversk, another town in northern Donetsk region, with Liman and Siversk under control, and with the Russians perhaps eventually moving to capture Kupiansk. Slavyansk, the city, the northern part of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, begins to look vulnerable, and with the Russians possessing air superiority and able to bomb at the intensity that we have seen, in that case, the situation of the Ukrainians begins to become very bleak. Well, that, it seems to me, is a summary of the situation on the day when the Russians have announced their victory in Avdeyevka. Now, some people seem to be oblivious to all of this. The Munich Security Conference continues underway. I remember with a mood of feelings of depression and some anger, the disastrous Munich Security Conference of February 2022, when it seemed to me that Western leaders who had gathered there, intoxicated by the thought of the sanctions war they were about to unleash on Russia, were busy egging each other on and egging Zelensky himself on, with Zelensky himself making a disastrous speech which President Putin cited when he announced his decision to recognize the two Donetsk republics and to launch the special military operation. A speech in which President Zelensky even appeared to suggest that Ukraine might acquire nuclear weapons one day. Anyway, at the Munich Security Conference this year, it seems to be, in some ways, almost as bad, but the detachment from reality this time is much greater. So we've had the German Defense Minister, Boris Pistorius, making a speech saying that the security architecture of Europe, which the Europeans and the Americans all thought had been created after the end of the Cold War, has been destroyed. Of course, he blames the Russians for that. And he now says that Ukraine belongs in NATO and the EU. I have to say again, I find these comments astonishing. When discussing the security architecture of Europe, the fact that the security architecture that was created after the Cold War, with the endless extensions eastwards of NATO, in violation of promises which were given to the Russians, that it was this flawed security architecture which created the crisis in the first place, seems to be something that Pistorius neither understands nor wants to acknowledge. That the Russians were given no stake in preserving the current security architecture and given every reason to want to see it ended. As I said, it does seem to cross his mind. Then we've had And then, of course, his suggestion that Ukraine's place one day is in NATO and in the EU, as I've discussed many times, all that does is simply incentivizes the Russians to continue their westward advance in a war that they are now conclusively winning. Anyway, that was Boris Pistorius. We've had pictures of Zelensky saying that, apparently he's been saying that if the United States won't become the anchor of Ukraine's defense, then Europe must fulfill that role. How can Europe fulfill that role? There's just been a report, again, about the complete failure of artillery shell production in Europe. I think it was in Bloomberg. The French are now being blamed for disrupting European plans to enhance artillery shell production. The fact is, artillery shell production in Europe is in chaos, and there seems to be no sign that that situation is going to be changed anytime soon. Certainly not quick enough for Ukraine. We've heard about the air defense coalition that the Europeans are going to cobble together to provide more missiles for Ukraine, air defense missiles for Ukraine. Well, as I said this in my previous program, I gained the impression that such an air defense coalition had been created a year ago, and Ukraine is now out of air defense missiles. Norway says it's going to supply more NASAMS systems, but it seems that these NASAMS systems will have to be manufactured before they're supplied. And then, of course, there's this claim that 1 million drones, the European Union will supply Ukraine with 1 million drones. All of this combining, tied up with this fantasy claim that FPV drones and other drones can somehow replace artillery shells or substitute for artillery shells. Something which anybody who tracks the situation on the battlefields, Ukrainian battlefields, with any attention knows is completely wrong and in fact a cruel deception on the Ukrainians. Besides, I think that the European Union does, as it happens, possess the capability to produce 1 million drones, a figure, by the way, which the Russians have comfortably exceeded, but never mind. I think the European Union probably could produce 1 million drones over the course of a year. But it has to be said, the Europeans have made various claims that they're producing all kinds of things, artillery shells, all kinds of equipment, air defense missiles, and the promises are made, but it never materializes. This equipment never materializes. And one has to be, given this constant pattern, one has to be dubious about drones, the whole issue of drones. Anyway, I have to say that the single most difficult thing for me about the Munich Security Conference is looking at all of these people, Jens Stoltenberg, Pistorius, Kuleba, the Ukrainian foreign minister, Zelensky himself, I believe his wife is there also, Navalny's wife too, she's also there. Anyway, I've been looking at all of these people. I'm not going to comment about Navalny's wife. I haven't seen pictures of her. But all of the others attending what looked like cocktail parties, chatting and smiling with each other. Given the realities of what is going on the Ukrainian battlefields, it just jars. And listening both to what these people say and to the way they appear, and putting that alongside with what is actually going on, the disconnection now seems to have achieved, frankly, extreme proportions. Now, perhaps not by accident, there's an article which has just appeared. It appeared yesterday, in fact, in The Hill in the United States. It's by Douglas McKinnon, who's, by the way, written fine articles on this very same question before. He was he's now a political and communications consultant, but he was a writer, which I take to mean a speechwriter for Presidents Reagan and George H.W. Bush, and a former special assistant for policy and communications at the Pentagon during the last 3 years of the Bush administration. I presume that means the George W. Bush administration, though The Hill doesn't say. But he makes exactly the same point that I've made about these people at the Munich Security Conference. And, well, the title in some ways is the most powerful part of this whole article. Raise your privileged hand if you're willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. And then it goes on to say, hey, what's 1 million dead and wounded when you live thousands of miles away in a bubble of arrogant privilege? Then he gives claims about Ukrainian and Russian losses. He says that US officials in August estimated that there were approximately 500,000 Russian and Ukrainian troops who have been killed or wounded since Russia's invasion in February 2022. That might actually be correct, but most likely the vast majority of those are Ukrainians, but McKinnon is careful not to say that. He says that recently a former intelligence officer told him that troop casualties are now over 1 million, and that the UN estimate of civilian deaths is dramatically higher, over 1 million dead and wounded, men, women, and children. And then he says, shouldn't that obscenely horrific death and casualty figure shock us? For a comparison, how would we react if every single man, woman, and child in Dallas, San Diego, Austin, Jacksonville, or San Jose were killed or wounded, while large parts of those cities were leveled to the ground by air and artillery bombardments? Then he goes on to say, sadly, but tragically, but purposefully, there's been very little reporting on the human cost of the war between Russia and Ukraine. Some in the media have seemingly morphed into stenographers for President Zelensky, beginning each story with the words "as Ukraine reports" or "as Zelensky states." And then he says that media sites can still be anti-Putin while professionally and ethically reporting the absolute facts on the ground, facts that paint a horribly tragic picture. And then he goes on to say, if the rationale by our governments, the United Kingdom and others in Europe, along with much of the media, academia, and various defense contractors, was to use Ukraine and its people as cheap, disposable pawns to be sacrificed in a proxy war against Vladimir Putin and Russia, then they're succeeding at a certain macabre fashion. He's careful not to say whether they're succeeding in weakening the Russians. We know the reality is otherwise. If you read his words carefully, and remember he is a writer, he's talking about succeeding in using the Ukrainians as a pawn in a game, not whether the game is actually being successfully run. But anyway, he then goes on to say, however, if the idea of supporting the Ukraine war with Russia was to save the people of Ukraine and the country's infrastructure, then those who advocated for that course have failed miserably. And then he discusses the state of the war itself. He still clings to the myth that this is a stalemate. I think the events in Avdeyevka tell us otherwise. But then he goes on to say, does any of this, he means the horror of the war, matter or register with the privileged and neocon class on both sides of the Atlantic, who, from the safety of thousands of miles away, whilst enjoying 6- and 7-figure salaries, continually advocate for the youth of Ukraine to march into the teeth of the Russian war machine. If they truly have no regard for the hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded, for the leveled infrastructure, for the 6 million plus who have fled Ukraine, for the billions of US tax dollars that seem to have gone missing, then what is their opinion with regard to triggering World War III? And then he talks at length about all the discussions about the dangers of World War III, dangers which, in my opinion, are overstated, but perhaps not to be entirely discounted. And then he goes on to say, because people of privilege, thousands away from the battlefield and carnage, decided to play a board game in which hundreds of thousands of human beings are sacrificed in the guise of saving a nation from Russia for nation-building purposes, to fight a proxy war leading the world to the razor's edge of World War III. Who will acknowledge the hundreds of thousands of men, women and children killed or wounded, or cry out in their defence? When did the outright slaughter of human beings or the very real possibility of igniting the next world war cease to matter to us? In such a war, even the privileged and profiting, living in bubbles of luxury, wouldn't be able to escape. Well, I agree with every sentiment expressed in this article. I will say that, again, it's striking that an article like this can appear in the United States, even despite all the problems and controls and criticisms that are made of the United States. It's still possible to write like this and to have an article like this appear in the mainstream media. And The Hill, by the way, is as mainstream as it gets. And, well, Douglas Mackinnon is right. He's right in every respect. And if you want examples, photos of exactly what he's talking about, people of privilege encouraging Ukrainians to go on fighting, to go on to their deaths, just look at these pictures that are coming from the Munich Security Conference. I hope, by the way, that people in Congress, The Hill is read widely by people in Congress, people in the Republican Party in particular, people in the House of Representatives, read this article by Douglas Mackinnon. I think it contains more truth about the reality of the war in Ukraine than, well, hundreds, perhaps thousands of others, which I have to read every day. Well, there are just a few things that I want to wrap up about. Firstly, President Putin is now in full election campaign mode. I've discussed how he went to Uralvagonzavod, and the place where the Russian tanks are now principally made. He then moved on to Chelyabinsk. He visited the Chelyabinsk forge and press plant. I believe, by the way, that is the same factory that used to previously make tanks. I believe it doesn't actually make tanks anymore. I would say it is the factory, one of the factories, the Jim Kinnair, whom I mentioned in my program yesterday. If you read his books, he's visited it. He can tell you a lot about this factory. But over the course of Putin's visit to Uralvagonzavod, the factory in Nizhny Tagil in the Urals, which makes the tanks, Putin had a very interesting conversation with the workers of that factory. Now, we mustn't take all of these conversations entirely at face value. No doubt, to some extent, they're staged. Though Uralvagonzavod is a factory which Putin acted to ensure that it was preserved at the height of the 2008 crisis, as I remember. It was one of those factories that he acted to preserve. He's certain to have the support of the overwhelming majority of workers of this particular factory. But anyway, a long discussion followed between members of this factory, workers at this factory, and Putin about the interconnections between Ukraine and Russia. And of course, the workers of this factory reminded Putin that Uralvagonzavod owes the fact of its existence as a tank production factory. It was originally built as a railway works in the 1930s and continues to make rolling stock. And in fact, they confirmed to Putin that production of rolling stock has actually increased. It's roughly doubled over the course of the last year. So that was an interesting fact in itself, by the way, because we'd previously been led to think that the entire factory had been devoted to tank production. But it seems that railway production for the railway continues there as well. Anyway, that's another matter. But anyway, the workers reminded Putin that during the Second World War, Uralvagonzavod was converted to tank production. And it did so because workers and engineers and machine tools were transferred there from what is now the Malyshev factory in Kharkiv, where the T-34 was originally designed and built, and that it was, as a result, possible for Uralvagonzavod, a converted and transformed Uralvagonzavod, then became Russia's leading tank factory, both during the war and afterwards. And this led to a very interesting discussion between Putin and the factory workers about the relations between Russians and Ukrainians. And I saw Putin make comments like this. It is common knowledge we have never made a distinction between Russians and Ukrainians, between Russia and Ukraine. Frankly, the overwhelming majority of those who lived in Ukraine and the absolute majority of those who live in Russia always thought they were the same thing. And he then discusses other things. He said that voters in southeastern Ukraine, apparently he mistakenly said southwestern Ukraine, but he said southeastern Ukraine, had always been pro-Russian, considered themselves Russian despite what was written in their passports. And he says that Ukrainian leaders, he means people like Kuchma and Yanukovych, came to power with the help of votes from these people, but then instantly gave up to the nationalists because they were arrogant and enjoyed support from abroad, primarily from the United States. But anyway, the long and the short of all of this, he talks a lot about the Germans as well, by the way, and the role the Germans had during the war. And he finishes and he says, as for our attitude to Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, I have spoken about this many times. I believe that the overwhelming majority of Russian citizens share these approaches. We will certainly counter any manifestations of extreme nationalism, Nazism. We will protect people who live there. And essentially, again, he's saying that Ukrainians and Russians are the same people. And he's talking about this increasingly now. He talks about this whenever he has the opportunity to speak on the issue of the Ukrainian conflict in public. And I have to say that that does, again, lead to questions about what might happen if there isn't a negotiation to try to end the war with the purpose of preserving as much of Ukraine as can be preserved as soon as possible. Anyway, I mentioned this. He also says a lot, by the way, about the tank fleet. He says that a portion of the equipment is wearing out and this must be replaced. This is the part that has arrived for repairs. You're dealing with it, T-62s and T-72s. They will be withdrawn. We need modern equipment, including the tanks you're making, the T-90 Provriv, the T-90M in other words, which he says is the best tank in the world. So bringing T-62s into the battlefront was a stopgap measure, probably in part intended to equip the Donbass militia. It's now been integrated into the Russian army. The tank drivers have been trained up to Russian army levels, and the older tanks can now be withdrawn, and that suggests to me that production of the more modern tanks must have increased significantly as well. Putin talks about a five-fold increase in tank production. Again, we're not provided with base figures, so it's difficult to know exactly what he means. The assumption in the West is that the tanks that the Russians are churning out are principally old refurbished tanks, but this comment of Putin's might suggest otherwise. Well, I'm going to finish this program by briefly returning to the topic of Navalny, because I come back to Douglas McKinnon's article. It seems to me that some people in the West are taking to heart the maxim often attributed to Joseph Stalin, that there's no evidence he ever said it. It's more plausibly actually comes from Germany. But anyway, that's another matter. Anyway, the maxim that the death of one man is a tragedy, the death of a million is a statistic. I am in no sense denying that the death of Navalny, about which I continue to have an open mind, by the way, is a tragedy. But far too many people in the West, all of those people seemingly attending the Munich Security Conference, people like, let me say a few words, Boris Pistorius, Annalena Baerbock, Zelensky himself, Ursula von der Leyen, who was also there. Well, they seem to be increasingly treating the war in Ukraine as if It's not a tragedy so much as a statistic. Certainly, that is the impression their words and their attitudes and their behavior imply. I would also say it's all become very obvious to me that for these people, the deaths of some people, some important people, some well-known people, are more tragic than others. There's been an ocean of words, angry comments and criticisms, maybe deserved angry words and criticisms of the Russian government connected with Navalny's death. None of these people, so far as I know, have said anything about my friend, Gonzalo Lira, who died in a Ukrainian prison with convincing evidence that he was mistreated in the course of it, and who was charged, despite being an American citizen, for doing no more than exercising his rights under the First Amendment of the Constitution to discuss the situation in Ukraine in English on an American platform, principally to Americans. Anyway, none of these people, so far as I know, have said a word about Gonzalo, even as they talk continuously about Navalny. And again, I find this disturbing, and so I think does much of the world. There's a report in Bloomberg that the Copenhagen process, the one launched basically by Jake Sullivan in August, the one in which Western countries try to rally the global South behind President Zelensky's non-peace plan, the one which requires Russia to capitulate completely. Anyway, there's a report in Bloomberg that suggests that the Copenhagen process has now entirely collapsed, that too many countries are staying away, and that the latest meeting of the Copenhagen group has been postponed, and perhaps postponed indefinitely. Well, again, given what's happening in Gaza and across the Middle East, is it surprising that some people in the Middle East might feel skeptical when they see this obsessive focus on the death of one man? There it is. I will say that part of the reason for this focus is genuine and sincere anger, not just about his fate, which might, as I said, there might be some grounds for anger in connection with it. I want to stress again, I have an open mind. But anger that Navalny is no longer there, and so that there is now no longer anybody who, even in their own fantasies, the West could plausibly imagine, or at least not plausibly, but could imagine taking over from Putin and leading Russia in a pro-Western direction. But also extreme anger that there is nothing they can do. There's lots of comments and claims that there must be punishment for Russia and for Putin in connection with this event. But of course they know that having already sanctioned Russia to the hilt, having issued strange, bizarre indictments against Putin, their arsenal of things that they can do against him and against the Russians is now empty. And that, of course, is true, not just about Navalny, but about the conflict as a whole. They're out of ammo and they're out of gas. Well, thank you for joining me again today for this program. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs in our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, Twitter X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget that you can also check our shop, also links under this video, all the amazing things that you will find there, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.